Number, the garden they couldn't kill. The bulldozer's engine cut through the pre-dawn silence like a chainsaw through bone. I stood at my kitchen window, coffee mug frozen halfway to my lips, watching 20 tons of yellow steel roll onto my backlot, without permission, without warning, without any legal right to be there. The operator didn't even look toward the house as he dropped the blade and began scraping away 2 years of careful cultivation me. Heritage tomatoes, my medicinal herb spiral, the raised beds that had fed half the neighborhood during the supply shortages last spring. Scout, stay, I commanded my German shepherd, who was already growling low in his throat at the window. I grabbed my phone and started recording as the machine systematically destroyed what the county had legally designated as protected agricultural land. The irony wasn't lost on me that Karen Whitley, Fair Hollow's self-appointed HOA dictator, had finally found a way to get rid of my unsightly garden. She'd been trying for 18 months, ever since I'd started growing food instead of maintaining the sterile lawn monoculture she demanded. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been documenting every violation, every forged permit, every illegal overreach since this war began. And now, with Hurricane Elena bearing down on us and supply chains already strained, they just destroyed the only reliable food source within 20 miles. They thought they were burying a problem. They had no idea they just planted evidence. My name is Joseph Callahan, and I'm a 42-year-old veteran who bought this 3-acre property in 2019 using my VA benefits. The land had belonged to my great-uncle Frank, a man who'd farmed these fields since the 1940s before Fair Hollow estates sprouted around him like suburban cancer. When Frank passed, I purchased the property from his estate, partly for the family connection, but mostly because I recognized what most people couldn't see. This wasn't just land, it was insurance. I'd served 3 tours overseas with the Army Corps of Engineers, specializing in disaster relief and infrastructure rebuilding. I'd seen what happened when supply chains collapsed in Puerto Rico after Maria, in rural Texas after the ice storms, in half a dozen countries where a single weather event could starve a region. The thin veneer of civilization depended entirely on trucks rolling in with food every few days. When the trucks stopped, people changed fast. So when I moved to Fair Hollow, I did what any sensible person would do. I prepared. The property came with original agricultural zoning dating back to 1952, grandfathered under county protection even as McMansions sprouted around it. I researched every regulation, filed every form, and established my small-scale agriculture operation completely within the law. I planted heirloom vegetables, medicinal herbs, and dwarf fruit trees. I installed rain collection systems and built a root cellar beneath my shed. I even added honeybee hives and started composting food waste from 3 neighboring restaurants. The garden wasn't just productive, it was beautiful. Garden club members from other neighborhoods would sometimes stop to ask about my trellising techniques or request cuttings from my heritage roses. I donated surplus produce to the local food bank every week and taught free workshops on preservation and seed saving. The children in the neighborhood loved collecting eggs from my small chicken coop and learning to identify edible plants. But Karen Whitley saw something different when she looked at my land. She saw disorder. She saw someone who hadn't asked permission. She saw a threat to her carefully controlled aesthetic vision of what Fair Hollow should represent. The first contact came in March 2021, delivered in a crisp envelope with the HOA letterhead. Dear resident, it began, though Karen had lived 2 streets over and knew my name perfectly well. We've received concerns regarding non-conforming landscaping visible from community thoroughfares. While we appreciate individual expression, Fair Hollow maintains certain standards to preserve property values and community harmony. The letter cited 17 different violations, from my visible rain barrels, to my excessive garden bed proliferation, to the industrial-scale compost operation in my backyard. Each citation included a proposed fine ranging from $50 to $200, with a total penalty approaching $3,000 for the initial assessment alone. I responded with copies of my agricultural zoning exemption, my county permits, and a polite letter explaining that my property predated their HOA by 60 years and remained outside their jurisdiction. I thought that would end it. I was catastrophically wrong. Karen's campaign against my garden began subtle and escalated to the criminal. She started by filing noise complaints about my morning rooster, which I didn't own, and odor complaints about my compost, which was turned properly and generated no smell beyond fresh earth. When the county investigated and found no violations, She shifted tactics. She organized impromptu neighborhood walks that somehow always ended with a crowd standing at my fence line, pointing and whispering. She posted in the community Facebook group about potential health hazards from my beehives and pest attraction from my fruit trees. She convinced the mail carrier that my garden gate blocked vehicle access and had my mail delivery temporarily suspended until I could prove the complaint false. The harassment intensified after my first television interview. A local news station had done a story about urban agriculture during the pandemic, and they'd featured my garden as an example of community resilience. The piece showed me harvesting vegetables for the food bank and teaching neighborhood children about sustainable growing. It was positive coverage that highlighted how one family's preparation had helped feed dozens during supply shortages. Karen apparently saw this as a declaration of war. Within a week, I found orange spray paint marking my fence posts supposedly to indicate non-compliant structures. My mailbox was repeatedly knocked over, and someone kept filing false reports with code enforcement about unpermitted buildings on my property. Each report triggered an inspection that required me to take time off work and escort officials around my land to prove, once again, that everything was legal and properly permitted. The breaking point came in August when I caught Karen's husband Todd attempting to photograph my property from inside my fence line. I'd installed game cameras after the vandalism started, and the footage clearly showed him cutting through my garden gate at 6 a.m. and walking among my beds with a measuring tape and camera. When confronted, he claimed he was conducting a community safety assessment and demanded I provide documentation proving my right to exclude him from my property. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with garden variety, pun intended, HOA overreach anymore. This was a coordinated campaign designed to force me out through legal harassment and manufactured crises. Karen had somehow convinced herself that my agricultural operation violated Fair Hollow's charter, despite the fact that my property wasn't part of Fair Hollow's legal jurisdiction. But her most brazen move came in October. I returned from a weekend visiting my sister to find a notice of pending action staked in my front yard. The official-looking document, complete with county letterhead and legal formatting, declared my property under review for health and safety violations and ordered me to cease all agricultural activities within 30 days or face enforcement action, including possible criminal prosecution. The document was completely fraudulent. The letterhead was forged, the signatures were fake, and the legal language was copied from unrelated zoning disputes in other counties. But it looked convincing enough that 3 neighbors called to ask if I was really being sued by the government. That forgery was Karen's first serious mistake. Impersonating county officials and issuing false legal documents wasn't just harassment, it was a felony. And unlike the petty vandalism and noise complaints, document fraud left a paper trail that led directly back to her computer printer. I'd been building my case file for 6 months before Karen handed me the smoking gun. Every harassment incident was documented with photos, timestamps, and witness statements. Every forged complaint was cross-referenced with the county's actual filing system. Every illegal entry onto my property was captured on game cameras with date stamps and GPS coordinates. But I had advantages beyond documentation. My 20 years of military experience had taught me patience, planning, and how to work within bureaucratic systems. My engineering background helped me understand the legal technicalities around zoning, permits, and property rights. And my disaster relief work had connected me with a network of people who understood the critical importance of local food security. Most importantly, I had an ally Karen didn't know about, Assistant County Attorney Maria Santos, a family friend who served with my unit in Iraq. Maria had been quietly monitoring the complaints filed against my property, and she'd noticed the irregularities long before I brought them to her attention. Forged documents with county letterheads automatically triggered fraud investigations, and Maria's office had been building their own case file on Karen's activities. She's crossed about 6 different lines, Maria explained during our November meeting at the county courthouse. Document fraud, criminal impersonation, filing false police reports, trespassing. We've got enough to charge her federally if we want to make a point. I studied the evidence folder she compiled. Karen's IP address traced to every forged complaint. Her printer metadata was embedded in the fake legal documents. Security cameras at the county office showed her researching official letterheads and copying legal language from public computers. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Keep doing exactly what you're doing," Maria said. "Maintain your garden, document everything, and let her keep digging this hole deeper." The more evidence she creates, the stronger our case becomes when we move. That's when Maria mentioned the detail that would make this case special. Fair Hollow was about to be tested by a real emergency, and Karen's campaign against local food production was about to collide with harsh reality. Hurricane Elena had formed in the Gulf 3 days earlier, and early tracking models showed it potentially making landfall near our region within 2 weeks. Even a near miss could disrupt supply chains for weeks, especially with existing port congestion and trucker shortages already straining the system. Your garden isn't just your property anymore, Maria explained. According to FEMA's new resilience guidelines, it's classified as critical local infrastructure. If someone destroys food production capacity right before a disaster, especially through illegal means, the federal penalties get very serious very quickly. I smiled grimly, thinking about Karen's latest threat to take action against my non-compliant agricultural structures. She'd picked the worst possible time to escalate this war. Hurricane Elena made landfall on a Tuesday morning in September, hitting the coast 80 miles south of us, with 130 miles winds. We caught the northern edge enough to knock out power for 6 days and flood the main highways, but not enough to cause major structural damage. It was exactly the kind of near miss that exposed how fragile our suburban infrastructure really was. By Thursday, the grocery stores were empty. The main distribution center had flooded, and supply trucks couldn't navigate the debris-clogged roads. The emergency shelter at the high school was overwhelmed, and FEMA was still trying to establish staging areas for relief supplies. People who laughed at my doomsday garden 6 months earlier were suddenly very interested in learning about food preservation and water purification. That's when Karen made her fatal mistake. On Friday morning, while I was checking storm damage to my greenhouse, a county demolition crew arrived with a work order to remove dangerous debris from my property. The crew chief handed me an official-looking document authorizing emergency clearance of storm-damaged agricultural structures posing public safety hazards. The problem was, my garden hadn't been damaged. The greenhouses were intact. The raised beds were fine, and my food plants were thriving despite the wind and rain. But the work order specifically targeted my unsecured livestock enclosures, chicken coops, unstable storage structures, root cellars, and contaminated water collection systems, rain barrels, exactly the infrastructure that had kept my food production running while everyone else lost power. I immediately called Maria Santos, who was already at the County Emergency Operations Center. "Joe, that's not our work order," she said. "Someone's using emergency authority to target your property illegally. Do not let them touch anything." I returned to the demolition crew with my phone recording. "This work order is fraudulent," I announced. "You're being used to commit a crime." The crew chief studied the document more carefully. "Ma'am, are you sure this is legitimate? The signatures look off, and this address isn't on our emergency action list." That's when I spotted Karen's SUV parked across the street, engine running, with Karen behind the wheel talking rapidly on her phone. She'd been watching, waiting for my garden to be destroyed so she could claim it was an unfortunate emergency action that she'd had nothing to do with. Instead, she'd just committed felony fraud using emergency authority during a declared disaster of federal crime with mandatory minimum sentences. The crew chief called his supervisor, who called the county, who called the sheriff. Within an hour, my property was crawling with law enforcement officers documenting evidence and taking statements. Maria Santos arrived with federal agents from the Department of Homeland Security because interfering with disaster relief operations fell under their jurisdiction. Karen tried to flee when she saw the federal vehicles, but police stopped her car before she reached the highway. The search of her vehicle revealed copies of the forged work orders, a county employee directory she'd used to research official signatures, and a printed checklist titled Emergency Action Planner, written intention to use the hurricane as cover for destroying my garden. But the most damning evidence was her laptop, which contained months of planning documents outlining her strategy to eliminate non-conforming land use through creative interpretation of emergency powers. She'd researched disaster authority laws, studied FEMA protocols, and developed a systematic plan to abuse emergency powers for personal vendettas. As the federal agents led Karen away in handcuffs, she screamed at me across the yard, "This isn't over. You don't belong here." She was wrong on both counts. Karen Whitley was charged with 14 felony counts including criminal impersonation, document fraud, conspiracy to commit property destruction, and abuse of emergency authority during a declared disaster. The federal charges alone carried potential sentences of up to 20 years in prison and $250,000 in fines per count. But the criminal charges were just the beginning. The county launched a full investigation into Fair Hollow's HOA practices and discovered that Karen had been systematically abusing her position for years. She'd filed false complaints against 17 different residents, forged official documents to intimidate property owners, and collected over $30 in illegal fines from homeowners who didn't know they could challenge her authority. The state attorney general's office opened a consumer fraud investigation that ultimately led to Fair Hollow's HOA being dissolved entirely and its assets distributed to affected residents as restitution. Karen was personally liable for every illegal fine, forged document, and fraudulent penalty she'd imposed, a total exceeding $180,000 in damages and penalties. Meanwhile, my garden became a media sensation. The story of an HOA president trying to destroy local food production during a hurricane resonated far beyond our community. I gave interviews to national news programs, testified before congressional committees about the importance of local resilience, and helped draft model legislation protecting agricultural rights in residential areas. FEMA formally designated my property as a community resilience hub and provided federal grants to expand the educational programs I'd been running informally. The county established an agricultural protection ordinance preventing HOAs from interfering with legal food production, and 3 neighboring communities established their own community garden programs based on my model. Karen pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for full restitution and agreed to a 5-year prohibition from serving in any HOA leadership position. She sold her house and moved to another state, unable to face the community whose trust she'd betrayed and the neighbors she'd harassed. On the 1-year anniversary of Hurricane Elena, Fair Hollow dedicated a community garden in the space where Karen's house had stood. The dedication plaque reads, "In memory of the lessons learned when preparation met persecution and truth overcame tyranny. I still live on my 3 acres, still grow food for my neighbors, and still teach workshops about resilience and self-reliance. Scout has gotten grayer, but he still patrols the garden perimeter every morning, keeping watch over the vegetables that proved more powerful than any HOA board. The best revenge, it turns out, isn't destruction, it's growth. While Karen's legacy crumbled into criminal conviction and exile, my garden just kept growing, feeding people, and proving that sometimes the smallest act of rebellion is simply refusing to ask permission to do what's right. Some battles are worth the ground you stand on. Mine happen to be 3 acres of the richest soil in the county, and I'm never giving it up."